I think the request for the talk came from the last hosting of the PRISM directors or PRISM coordinators meeting here at Buffalo State, and I had a bunch of live crayfish for people to look at. And unfortunately, I don't have a bunch of live ones today, but we'll talk about many of the same things we talked about then. So a lot of folks are interested in crayfish throughout the region. I'll just bring everyone's attention a new collaborative that began just recently, Invasive Crayfish Collaborative for the Great Lakes. This is started up really by Pat Charbonnet over in Illinois, and they'll have their first real meeting at or get together at a meeting this month in Illinois. And again, just for more information on invasive crayfish throughout the region, if folks are interested, you'd be able to go on this website as they get up and running to find more information on what's going on with recent advances in controlling for invasive crayfish. So the Invasive Crayfish Collaborative. So yeah, crayfish are interesting organisms, and globally, it's not a hugely species diverse group of organisms relative to some insects, for example, or lots of different plants. But in North America, right, we have very, very high crayfish diversity, and as you'll see later, some of the biodiversity issues for crayfish around the world are taking place in America, especially in Appalachia. But as a whole, as you'll see, this red Cambarids, the Cambaridae, that's the most common crayfish around here, and in North America. And then you'll see the Astacids in the Pacific Northwest. Other than that, those two groups, again, almost endemic here to North America. But again, traditionally, the crayfish themselves, not hugely diverse compared to other groups, but within North America, we see the greatest diversity of crayfish. And that's, that's very, very interesting, very good, but also makes it difficult when we're talking about trying to understand crayfish in North America, because they are somewhat difficult to identify, and there are a very large number of species in this part of the world. Okay, so for New York, New York is kind of a relatively easy place to work in because the crayfish fauna is not that diverse, and it's quite similar to the fauna that we see in Michigan. And so what I did here is Michigan has a very nice little poster for all of their crayfish, and in New York, depending on the source, there are often listed 8 to 10 species that are native to the state. I typically use 10 as being native to New York, and I'll show you which ones those are in just a moment. The oldest accounting really for a statewide list of species comes from early 1900s, 1905, Ortman, who lists 9 species as native to the state of New York. Turns out these are the same of these 9, 8 of them are also listed by Crocker in his Crayfish of New York as being native, and then he includes one of the burrowing crayfish. So as a look across this nice little poster here, as I mentioned, the crayfish fauna of Michigan is quite similar to ours. So this guy up here in the corner, devil crayfish, we also have big water crayfish down here. We also have northern clearwater crayfish. We also have White River crayfish. We also have, going to the other side, virile crayfish. Yes, we have calico crayfish. Yes, we have. And digger crayfish, native to Michigan. This is the one crayfish that Ortman does not list, but it is in the farthest western part of New York. So we actually do share this particular crayfish. The ones we don't have, this mud bug is a relatively new identified species for even for Michigan. In fact, it's newly identified in the last decade as a new species of crayfish. So we do not have that particular animal in the state. And then you'll see there's two invasives in Michigan: rusty crayfish, also invasive in New York; red swamp crayfish, also occurs and is non-native to New York. So as I mentioned, we share all these crayfish with Michigan other than the mudbug, this Cambarus that we don't have. And then not on this particular poster, spiny-cheeked Allegheny and Appalachian crayfish, which are native to New York. And I'll show you the full list here in just a moment. So a little bit about trying to recognize who these crayfish are when you encounter them, and some of the main ways that we identify and separate out the crayfish. So typical diagram of major body parts for crayfish, and relatively few features are necessary to identify the crayfish that we find in the state of New York, where the focus is going to be on see if my little poster, can't get my little dots to come up here. Oh, there we go. The claws will sometimes be important in identifying crayfish of New York. And I'll show you some of the typical things we look at in the claws. The rostrum, or sometimes the nose in between the eyes, its shape is useful for separating out the major groups of crayfish. The areola, this is a region between those suture lines on the carapace in the middle of the thorax. I'll show you, what those look like. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, the first two pair of swimmerets or pleopods, specifically on the males, that are used for definitive species identifications. So of these four features in the key to our native crayfish, here are some of the things that you might look for. So on the claws have two main parts that you'll see in the keys: the palm, or this large part of the claw that does not move, doesn't have any movable parts on it. So that's referred to as the palm or the propotus. And there's a lot of features on this part of the claw that the keys will refer to. Similarly, the finger, the movable part, the dactyl of the claw. The way I look at these, right? If you look at your own palm and hold all your fingers together and have only your thumb as being movable, the thumb would be the dactyl and the rest of your hand would be the propotus. The relationship of this movable dactyl to the palm is sometimes important. Okay, so the claw can sometimes be very useful in separating out some of the crayfish. Here are some of the things about claws. So you can see they're quite different looking, but some of the things that one wants to look for is whether there are large teeth that are very different in size compared to the other teeth that are on the claw. So you can see again a large median tooth. So where are those teeth? Out at the tip, near the base, in the middle. Are they present or absent? Are there really no teeth? It's relatively smooth. Things like that. Whether there are band patterns at the tip of the claws. So typical rusticus, for example, is a black band at the end of its claw. Sometimes they have a yellow band between two black bands, etc. So there's some features about the banding pattern at the tip of the claw. On the inner margin of the palm, there's a row, sometimes very uniform row of tubercles. Some of the keys want to know whether there are two distinct rows of tubercles, or a single row, or just a scattering of tubercles. Similarly, some of the claws have depressions on their margins, that will show up in the key. Other things about claws, again, the relative length of the dactyl to the whole claw. In looking at this range of claws, you'll see these two claws here have an overall shape that should suggest they are thin and linear, whereas these particular claws are very robust and more rounded. Again, the sort of the overall shape of the dactyl versus the palm are recognizable among the crayfish. Okay, so claws can be important. What else? The rostrum. So the structure between the eyes on the crayfish. The rostrum, two typical forms that you'll see in a rostrum. The typical Faxonius form is often referred to as trident shaped, or the point here is that there are these acute points on the shoulder versus the median point. So a typical little trident shaped with spines on the tips of those. So again, that's typical for the Faxonius. And then the other typical rostrum is this rounded shoulder form. This is the typical Cambarus rostrum. So the shoulders here don't have these sharp points as you'll see over here in the Faxonius rostrum. Again, the shapes of these rostrums, usually they're fairly easy to see, but in an older animal, of course, these pointed shoulders can erode a bit on really older crayfish, so sometimes they're not super easy to see. What I typically do when I'm looking for these is I take a white postcard and just slip it underneath the rostrum above the antennules. It helps those really stand out. So that, again, and that will separate many of the crayfish into the two major genera that we have in New York. Okay, so claws and rostrum. The other feature that's important to look at is the areola. Again, this is a region between these suture lines on the thorax. And in the keys, the point for New York is whether the areola is present or the areola is absent. So the two suture lines touch each other. If we were looking at crayfish beyond New York, there's many other descriptions for areolas. So when they're present, they're often measurements then are needed, whether they are narrow or they're broad, and it's a little more complicated. But for New York, it's either they're present or the areola is present, so there's a space here, or there is areola is absent, so the suture lines touch. And then lastly, so we had claws, rostrums, areolas, and of course the first pair of swimmerets or pleopods. In the male, these pleopods are hard and sclerotized. In the female, those first swimmerets are soft and pliable, just like the rest of the swimmerets along the abdomen. The function here, of course, is the transfer of sperm packets from males to females with these sclerotized appendages. And they're generally very easy to tell apart, males from females. However, males do shuttle between reproductive and non-reproductive forms, call them Form 1 and Form 2 males. In the Form 1 males, these swimmerets are firmly sclerotized, and all of the key features at the tips of these pleopods are identifiable. Form 2 males, generally you can still see that these look like modified sperm transfer organs, though many of the definitive features at the tips and the overall shapes are not evident. So to do real species identification, you really do need to have a Form 1 male to make that possible. And again, so in the females, though, all of the pleopods are soft and pliable. So it's a fairly easy way to tell the species or the sexes apart. Okay, so given that, This is what I use for a field key for the species found in New York. This key was generated by, oh my gosh, drawing a blank now. Daniels, Bob Daniels over at the Museum of Science. And this is his field key that he used for identifications, and it works pretty good. And what I've done is I've modified it a little bit to indicate those individuals that are native and those that are non-native to the state of New York, as identified by Ortman. And traveling down the key, as you can see, the non-native taxa, Procambris clarki, the red swamp crayfish. It can be found in the central part of the state, in New York. Other non-native crayfish, Faxonius neglectus, the ringed crayfish in the lower Hudson, Long Island region, entered the state, well, maybe a decade ago or so. So that's to be found in New York. Faxonius rusticus, you know, this is the crayfish that most of us hear about, rusty crayfish. There's been a lot of work done with that animal. And then, where am I at here? Oh, those are the non-native ones. And then the rest of the crayfish being native, so clearwater crayfish, a small-bodied crayfish, very common in many of our streams, large and small, especially here in the West. Spiny-cheeked crayfish. There was some questions before whether this guy was native or not. I think, again, Ortman listed it as native, and I certainly would have called it native. It's fairly common in the eastern part of the state, especially smaller streams and clearer waters. There's the two non-native. The virile crayfish. This is a large water crayfish. It's a very, very large bodied crayfish as well. Fairly common in the Niagara River, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. Allegheny crayfish, as the name implies, smaller streams here in the West especially. Again, native. Phallicambarus phodians and Cambarus diogenes. These two crayfish are found here in the West. Phallicambarus is the one species I typically think of as native, although Ortman did not list it. But it is found in the farthest western part of the state. These two animals are burrowing crayfish. So, you know, you'll actually find them more in terrestrial habitats, you know, riparian areas adjacent to stream ditches or ponds, things of that nature. So they build burrows, and they spend nearly their entire lives in those burrows, coming out for reproduction and some foraging. These again, the burrowers. And Phallicambarus is the only one not listed by Ortman as being native, but I know that they're to be found in the far western part of the state. Cambarus acutus, the White River crayfish, sometimes confused for red swamp. They're both actually often have this bright red color to them. Fairly common crayfish around some of the Finger Lakes and places like Iroquois Refuge here in the western part of the state. Also down Hudson Valley as well. Calico crayfish, very nice, attractive little crayfish. Here in the West, we certainly find it in tributaries to the Niagara River. It's one of the few crayfish that also has some commercial applications. So there are a small commercial facility that rears immunus for sale to other states, bait vendors. In fact, I had a request a couple years ago from this particular vendor who was trying to sell bait vendor crayfish to the state of Michigan, and immunus is not a is native to Michigan, and they needed to be verified that this is what they were. They weren't some other taxa, so we were able to at least assure that all the specimens sent to us from this particular commercial vendor were in fact immunus. So again, there is some commercial activity in crayfish for New York. And then the last two crayfish, both Cambarus, Bartonii, Appalachian brook crayfish, and big water crayfish. Both of these are crayfish that do require fairly clean water. Cambarus robustus is a pretty good size crayfish. And again, these guys are found out here, at least in the more headwaters of our cleaner streams throughout the Allegheny drainage. Okay, so yeah, the key is fairly easy to use, so using those 4 features that I talked about. And again, of the 13 or so species found in the state, I would put 10 of them as native, 3 as non-native. Okay, so what's going on with crayfish around the world? Well, as I showed you earlier, the Africa and Antarctica are the 2 continents that really were historically devoid of crayfish. But Africa is undergoing probably the largest introduction of crayfish on a continental scale. And the 3 crayfish that come up more often globally as being problems for other countries, a relatively new phenomenon is Procambarus virginalis, or you may have been hearing about marmocrebs. This is that very interesting parthenogenic crayfish that is just materialized. The marmocreb having 3 sets of chromosomes, so the females here can produce viable offspring without doing any mating. And these guys are now widespread in Europe. They're showing up in Africa, and quickly, as you might guess, without having the requirement for any reproduction, they're able to populate areas fairly quickly, and again, posing a lot of problems for Europe and Africa. Procambus clarki, this red swamp crayfish, which again is also here in New York, but not native here, is very widely introduced crayfish, primarily for culinary purposes. Red swamp crayfish is one of the more popular crayfishes you find in a lot of southern crawfish dishes, right? So etouffee and just broiled crawfish. It's red swamp crayfish. So they were introduced to Europe and Africa for commercial purposes, and it's actually an extremely aggressive crayfish. I would say probably even more so inherently aggressive even than rusty crayfish. It's an amazing little animal. But again, widely introduced in Africa and Europe. And then Paciphasticus liniculus is very widely distributed, also introduced into Europe to overcome crayfish losses there. But it was this guy that probably was the culprit behind the crash of crayfish in Europe. So all of our North American crayfish do carry what's known as crayfish plague, Aphanomyces astica, and it was introduced in Europe, again, probably from Paciphasticus in the late 1800s, and really decimated the entire European crayfish fauna. And also Australian and Japanese crayfish are susceptible to this plague, whereas all of our North American species are pretty immune to it. So it's been a terrible problem for all the crayfish fauna in Europe, Japan, and Australia. So again, real briefly, so red swamp crayfish, native as you might guess to the south, and it's widely distributed now in North America. And here you can see the locations in New York where it can be found. Lake Erie, center part of the state. Again, it's a very aggressive crayfish. I would really encourage everyone to keep their eyes out and keep tabs on where this guy is found. Probably the most widely distributed crayfish in the world. As you can see now, all of these areas of Africa, where it's been introduced primarily for aquaculture purposes. Europe, again, probably the culprit behind the introduction of the plague, but also was introduced for aquaculture purposes and now widely distributed, throughout Asia, South America. Again, very, very widely distributed invasive species in other places besides just here. But what the crayfish that we hear most about, Orconectes rusticus, now several locations in New York, the Susquehanna drainage, both Lakes Ontario and Erie. And again, this guy, lots and lots of research published on its impacts in habitats, both standing water, flowing water, a lot of interest in its ability to outcompete native crayfish, its ability to potentially eat fish eggs, its function potentially as an ecosystem engineer, eliminating macrophytes. So, crayfish that, again, a lot of research has been conducted on, and again, we're constantly, wanting to keep tabs on where this guy shows up. Okay, so then just a couple of brief little global comments and wrap up with just a couple of key points. So on the right here is just the global species account, species richness for the globe, and you can see again, species richness isn't super high, except for this great explosion of crayfish in the southeastern U.S. So throughout Appalachian, a lot of endemic species there. The karst geography and things of that nature, and isolated watersheds have led to a lot of endemism, for the crayfish in the southeast. But in terms of the issues for crayfish globally and crayfish that are, at risk for various reasons, again, that area of high diversity in the southeast is also the region that we see the most at risk species for a variety of reasons. And those reasons have multiple sources, but for here in North America and in that region, water pollution, urban development, a couple of the real big issues for the southeast as they continue to move into watersheds where these species are endemic. Other invasive species causing issues isn't one of the main reasons for crayfish species declines, but that's in that particular part of the world or that region in the southeast. It's that a lot of those habitats are somewhat isolated, remote for introductions of new invasive species of crayfish, whereas in a region like ours where the crayfish fauna is fairly limited, introduction of even a single crayfish could certainly have some other impacts on native crayfish that we should keep our eyes on. Okay, so just to wrap up, again, crayfish very, very diverse in terms of the kinds of functions that they do in habitats, controlling plant biomass, species richness and diversity of macroinvertebrates and other things, nutrient cycling, substrate bioturbation, part of that. They scavenge. They're also prey items. So again, just a wide number of roles that they play. Again, identification of crayfish in general is not the simplest thing because it requires those Form 1 males for definitive identification. But within New York, actually the identification of these using that field key is not that difficult. To my knowledge, there's not yet an eDNA library for all the crayfish. So, hopefully that'll come about someday. And then the one comment I had is too that bait vendors and biological supply houses are two vectors that are in, I think, dire need of some education as sources for introductions of these animals. Again, both of those commercial industries don't require that people that work there are able to identify crayfish. So it, I think, is something that's really in need of some education to make sure that folks know what they have on hand. Okay, and with that, I think we'll just finish it up and open for any questions.